To understand the situation and the possible development of the situation, I'm very pleased to be joined from Southwest China, Chongqing Municipality by Professor Zhiguang of the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University in Shanghai, and Ben Norton, Editor-in-Chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. He's joining us from Beijing. Gentlemen, welcome to the discussion. Ben, let me get to you here. Exactly what are we looking at? How would you describe the situation, and how serious is it?
This is a blatant war of aggression. The US and Israel have launched attacks on Iran, blatantly violating the sovereignty of Iran. This is a clear violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter, which says very clearly that a state cannot attack another state. And this is, one of the main 4 crimes established by the International Criminal Court, is a war of aggression. Now, why is the US doing this? Well, Donald Trump posted a video on social media in which he called for overthrowing the Iranian government. Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu did the same. They're trying to overthrow an independent sovereign government, and there have been reports that the Trump administration has been holding meetings with the so-called exiled Crown Prince Pahlavi. Let's not forget that the US has a long history of meddling in Iran's internal affairs. In 1953, the CIA and British intelligence organized a coup d'etat that overthrew Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and put in power the previous Shah, the king of Iran, who was overthrown in the 1979 revolution. And ever since then, the US has been trying to destabilize and overthrow the Iranian government. Now, Trump says that this is about nuclear weapons, which is preposterous. This is not about nuclear weapons, because if he was really concerned about nuclear weapons, Trump would have stayed in the nuclear deal that not only the US, but the other 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and the European Union all agreed to in 2015. Under that agreement, which according to international moderators, international observers, Iran was abiding by the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, and Iran would never have been able to get nuclear weapons because of that deal. But in 2018, Trump withdrew from the deal. And since then, Trump has claimed that he wanted negotiations. And ironically, Iran's current president, Masoud Pezeshkian, is a reformist. He actually did want to sign a new agreement with the West, despite some critics in Iran who said that the West could not be trusted. So last year, they were having so-called negotiations, and the US and Israel attacked Iran for 12 days. They clearly used these so-called negotiations as a ruse, as an illusion, and attacked Iran. And now they've gone even further and said that they're going to try to overthrow the Iranian government. Trump is calling for the Iranian military to overthrow the government. So, this is regime change. This is a blatant war of aggression. It's not about nuclear weapons. Iran was more than willing to come to a new agreement after the US withdrew from the previous agreement. But the reality is that Washington doesn't want an agreement. They want regime change.
It is perplexing, isn't it? Because they were, again, in the middle of negotiations. There were no talks that the negotiations, so-called negotiations, fell apart. Actually, these talks were supposed to continue in the next few days in Austria. And the mediator, the go-between of the two sides, actually, when talking to the American press, said there is hope of a peace deal. They just need a little bit more time. And on the Iranian side, they were reiterating that they want to negotiate, they want a deal, that they don't want nuclear weapons. And yet the United States seem to be determined and getting ready actually to strike Iran together with Israel. Professor Ng, exactly why did the United States and Israel launch these latest round of military strikes? What do you think they're going after?
All right. I think Norton has already laid out the historical background pretty clearly. And as you clearly stated, the negotiation process has been going well. So based on the evidence, the existing evidence, we can only assume that the negotiation diplomacy has never been the goal of both governments, neither Israel nor America. They have been aiming for war in the very beginning. And the external factor, since the diplomacy is not an issue, there is no geopolitical gain that they could get based on a military action that they couldn't get from diplomacy. So henceforth, we can only assume that the war itself is aiming for their own domestic politics. So for Netanyahu, I have always assumed that I have always argued that Netanyahu's purpose was to extend the war permanently so that he can stay in power. So it's the same thing for Donald Trump. Donald Trump has an incoming midterm election, which he cannot fail. And the only thing that could protect him from a sort of political failure domestically was something that is glorious, deflect people's attention away from domestic shambles that he created, and then start to focus every resources and everybody's attention on external war, which in this case, the war against Venezuela couldn't achieve it. And then the only thing that could achieve the attention on that scale was a full-scale war on Iran. And in addition, I believe that the war on Iran was something that the U.S. Reformed military under Donald Trump's regime a war on Iran is the common target that the fractured U.S. military could agree on. So Iran was a safe choice for the U.S. as a military target.
Is there, Professor Yin, is there still a shred or an iota of regard to international norm, international law, to the sovereignty of any other country in this world that the Trump administration would hesitate and say it is against the internet, it is the invasion of another sovereign country, we are going to be very careful about this? It seems that from the very beginning it's out of the question.
All right. I think for the hegemonic powers like the United States, I have always calling those hegemonic centric powers as imperialist countries. International law has never been a common sense. The international law basically serves the purpose of a tool that whenever it fits the needs of the imperialist power, it will invite international law over. Whereas it doesn't, the international law is something that can be disregarded as they please. So international law, if we see it from hegemonic centric perspective, international law has never been at the center. Whereas
yeah, but at least I understand your point. But at least in the past, there's at least this thin veil that you need to.
Yeah, of course. I mean, as I said, whenever they suit their needs, whenever it's convenient, international law could come into place. But whenever things get ugly, get dirty, international law was gone. And it's no difference it's futile to make a difference between Donald Trump's war against Iran and let's say George W. Bush's illegal war against Iraq in 2000s.
So, Ben, what are we looking at in terms of the international order? It seems that the United States is hell-bent in just going, after its geopolitical targets whatsoever, regardless of any international rule or law. It just basically go after it, the rule of the jungle in the most glaring terms.
Yeah, I strongly agree with Professor Yin in the sense that if you look at the policy of U.S. presidents for decades, not just Trump, he's the most, bombastic and overt. But we've always seen this instrumentalization of international law only when it's convenient, and it's ignored when it's not convenient. And I think it's very important to look at the comments made by Stephen Miller, who is the deputy chief of staff for the Trump White House, after the U.S. invaded Venezuela and kidnapped Venezuela's internationally recognized constitutional president Maduro. Stephen Miller did an interview on CNN, and he said, "We are a superpower. We are going to use force whenever we think it's necessary. We're not going to apologize." He essentially said this is the law of the jungle. And this has really always been U.S. foreign policy, but previously other leaders, especially Democrats, would talk about democracy and human rights, but they all knew that it was hypocritical. We know this because Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, gave this very revealing speech at Davos in which he said that the so-called rules-based order was always hypocritical. The imperial powers always violated those rules when it was convenient. Now, I want to go back just a few years in history to understand the context here, because I agree with most of what Professor Yin said, and certainly I think the domestic situation in the U.S. and Israel is certainly relevant. It's always relevant. But I think there's a much larger, a kind of longer historical mission here that goes back well before Donald Trump. And it was spelled out by the former US General Wesley Clark, who is the commander of NATO. And immediately after 9/11, after the 11th of September attacks in 2001, Wesley Clark was a top official at the Pentagon, and he later revealed that the Pentagon had made plans to overthrow 7 governments in the Middle East and North Africa. And 6 of those 7 they succeeded in: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Somalia, Libya, and Sudan. The US invaded, bombed, and/or overthrew all of those governments, and the remaining government was Iran. That was the cherry on top. The US has been trying to
fulfilling their wish list now?
Of course, and it took much longer than they thought it would take, but
do you think they're going
the US has been trying to remake this entire region to control one of the most strategic regions on Earth, which of course goes without saying, it has the largest oil and gas reserves on Earth.
Well, judging from the swiftness and the resolute responses we're seeing, both before the strikes in verbal terms and also immediately after the US and Israeli military strikes, we're hearing reports of Iranian strikes on US military facilities in Bahrain, for instance. Judging from these responses, how do you see things playing out? Is Iran going to capitulate?
There's no question. Iran already is retaliating. The US has at least 40,000, perhaps more than 50,000 troops in the region, and a dozen military bases and other military installations all surrounding Iran in the region. There are already reports just a few hours after the initial US-Israeli attack that Iran has hit multiple US military installations, including the Al Udeid base, which is very important in Qatar, and also in Bahrain. So Iran, I think, recognizes that this is an existential war, that the 12-day war last year was kind of a rehearsal. The US and Israel started that war, and again, they started this war. Both were wars of aggression, but I think last year, the US and Israel, and also Iran, were trying to test the capacity of the other side. And Iran did show last year, despite the fact that Iran did not use all of its modern technology, including hypersonic missiles. Iran was mostly using some of its older missiles, but we now see reports that Iran understands that this is existential. It's going to retaliate, and we've already seen reports of heavy missile strikes and drone strikes. And let's not forget that Iran has significant capacity in building drones, which are very important for modern warfare.
Professor Yin, how do you look at the potential seriousness of this conflict as Iran is retaliating in such a manner? Do you think this is going to be very much different in terms of its veracity and its scale and potentially length compared to the conflict last year?
I mean, it's very difficult to predict the trajectory of this war at the current stage, but I really, from my personal perspective, I hope that there could be a stopper point for the US hegemonic aggression of the world, or particularly the Trump's hegemonic aggression of the world, by retaliating, by letting the Americans and the Israelis suffer militarily. And this is important in the sense that it's not a imperialist type of war. It should be a war against imperialism. So the war against imperialism puts hope back into the restoration of the global order. That cannot be achieved only when the global South countries join together and have a common goal to go for. And that only by that, the entirety of the global South countries join together and recognizing that the hegemonic-centric global politics will never lead them to the prosperity that they were promised to. So henceforth, global order will be restored once the rest of the world join together.
Particular juncture, what can global South countries do? I mean, the United States is the single superpower with probably the strongest military might in the world at this particular moment. Do you think Iran is going to fight it out alone with verbal support, moral support from other countries in the world? Professor In, very briefly, please.
I don't think Iran is fighting alone. Now we have seen Yemenis joining the campaign against the US and Israel, and I'm pretty sure even with the decline of the Shia retaliation area, the Lebanese, the other parts of the Middle Eastern countries will join together, and then the rest of the world, the global South countries, including China and hopefully Russia, would and hopefully possibly India, but I don't really hold a very strong hope on that. But hopefully everyone else will join together and voice against the illegality of this war. And I also hope the European countries would stand up together and call out the true nature of this war. This is a war of aggression.